Alderman Karen.
Here.
Alderman Jettie.
Here.
Alderman Gavea.
Here.
Alderman Camo is here. Alderman Dowd.
Present.
Alderman O'Brien.
Present.
Alderman Moran. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in attendance. Also in attendance, Alderman Wilshire, Alderman Klee, Tim Cummings, and Jill Stansfield.
Okay, and you have Director Cummings, you mentioned.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Alderman Melbourne Moran has important business this evening, so I will be chairing tonight's meeting. And I'll open up for public comment. And our rules for public comment is 3 minutes. Please state your name and your address, and we'll run the clock for you, and we'll advise you when you're almost done. So you do want to speak, ma'am? Please come forward. This is your time. This is your claim to fame.
First of all, thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Betsy Gamrat. I live at 10 Wood Street in Nashua, and I'm here representing the people who can't get a job because they don't have a car, and they can't get a car because they don't have a job. We need to stop talking about parking and start talking about transportation, because people should not have to buy a car to get to a job, to pay for the car, to park it. They need to be able to get to work, school, shopping, recreation in a timely manner, safely and reliably, 7 days a week. NTS is offering a fair hourly rate at beautiful bonus. The only way we're going to attract drivers is by raising that rate, and to raise the money to pay more, we need to increase the cost of parking in the city, and we need to install speed cameras with automated enforcement. That should raise enough money to be able to pay more so that we can get that bus service to help the people get around the city. Parking is a symptom of a transportation problem. It's not a problem itself. The problem is that we need to give everyone an alternative to using a private automobile. The best decisions are made based on data. So let's measure foot traffic starting now in the center of Nashua, and then let's restart that farmer's market. Bring people back to the city. Open the main street from 10 to 2 on Sundays to foot traffic and the farmer's market, and keep measuring that foot traffic. By the end of the year, we'll have some good data to see whether there's adequate parking to allow that foot traffic to sustain the local businesses and improve our city without more parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else for public comments? Seeing nobody, that concludes the public comment segment. And on the agenda, as everybody's noticed, up for discussion this evening is the parking study. So I'll call forward Director Cummings and Ms. Jill Stanfield. Please feel free to occupy any of the empty seats. You can sit side by each if you wish, or whatever.
Separated.
Yeah, exactly. Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer.
You might not have recognized me in with my new look.
I know.
Are you hooking up your computer?
I know.
Yeah, I think tonight we were kind of hoping to have Mr. Hill of Desmond Associates with us.
That's correct, Mr.
But
Chairman.
there is inclement weather out there, so
and we-
perhaps maybe Mr. Hill could not make it this evening.
No, Mr. Chairman, he is on his way. We just got notice that he's a few minutes away. Well, the last word was as he was passing Kinsley's House of Pizza, so he should be with us shortly. But if I could take a moment and address maybe the comments that were just made by during public comment, because I think that they're worth discussing and noting. If I may, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely, please.
Thank you. I applaud the comments that just came. I actually believe that those comments are well-founded, and I would ask this body to think about the words that you just heard. and hope that they resonate. I think that the idea that we're building more parking is counterintuitive in urban planning, and I would not recommend it. And what I would say is what we need to do is to look to long-term solutions to providing mass public transit. We need to start planning in those terms right now if we're going to move away from the idea of providing additional parking supply. But as of to date, we haven't taken on that robust discussion. And so what we need to do is have an incremental approach, which is what I think you're hearing us talk about now, is to until we get to the place where we have that robust mass public transit, we do have a hybrid solution. And you know, where we are providing some sort of parking and increasing that supply, though always doing it in a measured way, where we want to ensure that we are moving away from the idea of single occupancy vehicles. And certainly we should move away from planning our downtown or urban core environment around a single occupancy vehicle type of planning. And so it's more of going back to the way it used to be back in the 1600s or the 1700s or even in the 1800s, when you had that village concept and where you have the mixed uses all together in a highly dense area, so it's walkable. This village type planning is what is very successful in the inner core. And to be able to do that, you really need to think about your parking more as a utility, and you're providing it as a service, like the way you would sewer or the way you would your water. That way you can get the built environment that will achieve that walkability that we know is more sustainable over the long term, which is we should look to do. But it doesn't come overnight. Rome wasn't built in a day, and we need to just be mindful that we should be trying to do this in a very measured and thought out way, and which is why we're suggesting this incremental type of solution until we do get to the point where we can have that more robust public transit oriented solution. One that I fully applaud and would commit to starting to work towards now. I know Director Sullivan and I have been having this conversation over the last few months. I'll leave my comments there, Mr. Chairman, as our consultant has arrived, Andy Hill. If I could pass it over to him, I would greatly appreciate it.
And welcome, Mr. Hill. You could take your coat off and stay a while if you so choose. We're not going to run you out of the building. No, sir.
That's okay. I can't run very fast right now.
Welcome. And Mr. Hill, as you go with your presentation and everything, any objection to fielding questions, or do you want to complete your presentation and then field questions?
I am happy to field questions as we go along. So.
Okay. Everybody get that? We'll open it up for questions. Just raise your hand for decorum purposes to be recognized. And please keep in mind that as with all of these meetings right now, they are kind of conceptual to some point. Nothing's really 100% etched in stone. So, you know, doesn't necessarily mean, but it gives us a direction of which way we're going to go with this in the future. So with that, Mr. Hill.
Thank you. The last time that I was in front of this body, we spent some time talking about the existing conditions and operations portions of the study. This evening, I'm going to take you through the future conditions, projections here, and then we will be wrapping it up with the structure of the implementation plan that we're proposing at this point in time, which ties all of these things together. We had three planning perspectives or planning horizons that we were looking at in terms of future conditions. Near term was really looking at within the next 4 years, a lot of the things that are driving That analysis are things that are in the process right now. They've been funded, or they've been approved, or they're pending review and approval here. Significant number of those developments are actually the reoccupancy of formerly vacant space or change of use in existing buildings. So that's a fairly concrete projection going into the future. Once you get beyond that, into the midterm, that's 5 to 7 years, a lot of those developments are conceptual in nature here. They're plans that have been laid in place. They're ideas for what might be in the offing based on current market conditions here. But it's still to some degree quite conceptual. And then when we talk long-term, 8 to 10 years out, this is the larger scale initiatives or plans. Mr. O'Brien was Tim was alluding to earlier here when he talked about a large-scale conversion over to alternative modes of transportation. A lot of the planning that's going on right now just east of the study area in the East Hollis zone sort of falls into this bucket as well. And we'll go through what's in each one of those scenarios as we go along here. Some things that I want to, I'd like this group to.
Yeah.
There we go.
Are we covering all of these slides this evening?
That is my hope, yes, sir.
Because my history and presentation is 3 to 5 minutes per slide. At 3 minutes a slide, that's 2 hours. At 5 minutes a slide, that's 3.5 hours.
A lot of these, I don't think we're gonna need that amount of time to go over.
All right, just want to.
Some things to keep in mind here as we're looking, going forward here. Nashua is in a very unique position at this point in time. Yes, you have some parking challenges. Parking challenges are a lot like weight challenges in that they are the result of a robust and healthy environment here. You don't see municipalities that are struggling to stay afloat or individuals who are struggling to get a meal struggle with those particular challenges. They're a good problem to have. However, you are reaching a point where you're going to have to make some decisions about how to handle parking and how to deal with parking in the future. What I'm going to be walking you through with the future conditions is a worst case scenario. And this worst case scenario is assuming two major things. One, that you continue to go forward with your zoning as it applies to parking in the D1 and D2 district as it currently exists. And that a number of the policy changes that we recommended last meeting are not adopted and not implemented. So it is a status quo projection, if you will. Where we saw development coming in, where we knew that there was private parking associated with that particular building, that particular development, we did credit the absorption of that private parking with that development. Where the development was coming in without planned private parking associated with it, we were tasked with projecting the parking demand out into the nearest available public parking facility that was typically within 1 to 2 blocks of wherever that development was coming in here. As you'll see as we get into the midterm, when we got to the point where there was not any available public parking within 1 to 2 blocks of some of these developments, that's where we started to really create a quantification of the unmet demand associated with that project. The other thing that I'll remind you is that each one of these phases are iterative, and they'll become very clear as we go through the process here. But you'll see how these things can potentially build on themselves here over time if there are corrective actions taken. However, this analysis does also include the impacts associated with the outdoor dining program. In terms of how we projected this going forward, we worked off of Urban Land Institute, Institute of Transportation Engineers, and American Planning Association base demand ratios. These ratios are developed through observation of existing land uses, occupied land uses, and a calculation based on peak demand for what the relationship is between that land use and parking. For example, retail space in an environment like downtown Nashua is typically at 3.0 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Restaurant is typically at 9.0 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Residential, the standard that we were using was 1.5 spaces per residential unit. In some cases, when we were looking at emerging developments, there wasn't necessarily a unit count. So where there wasn't a union count, we looked at the total square footage that had been allocated to residential and made the assumption that there was going to be a correlation of roughly 1,100 square feet per unit. So the way we did this, yes, sir.
Could I just, GFA, is that gross floor
Gross
area?
floor area, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Gross floor area. So the way, like I said, this is an iterative process here, so we took a look at what the baseline utilization was based on our observations here on both weekdays and weekends, in the daytime and the evening. We covered this at the last meeting here as far as these observations went here. Overall, just to keep in mind, across the entire study area, we're looking at a 47% utilization rate. Obviously with variations, as you can see in the diagrams here, some blocks being more utilized or more intensively used than others. On a weekday evening, it was a 29% aggregate utilization rate. On weekdays, we found about 13 block faces that were running between 85 and 100% utilization or higher. On weekday evenings, it was 20 block faces. We did not find any facilities, off-street facilities, that were running at or over capacity in either one of these times. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick question. When you were talking about these parking utilizations, these aren't just city parking, this is private and,
This is private and
And
public. This is all 108 blocks and 13,000 plus spaces.
so a business may have a parking lot that is underutilized, but that's theirs and not the city's?
Yes.
Just so I clarify that. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, as we discussed the last time we met, private parking facilities account for about 7,000 of the 13,000 parking spaces here in town, and they typically hover around 45% utilization. So there's a lot of available capacity there. Similarly, on the weekends here, again, we had pockets where we had high levels of utilization in particular blocks, but overall, the typical utilization was around 28% of the total supply across the entire study area. We had identified 21 block faces on a Saturday day and 27 block faces on a Saturday evening that were running 85 to 100%, most of those in the Main Street corridor here. But again, there was quite a bit of available capacity in both public and private facilities off-street at this time. So onto this, we then layered a total of 34 developments that make up the near-term developments here. That includes about 26,000 and a half square feet of retail, a little bit more than 8,000 square feet of restaurant, 89,000 square feet of office, 17,500 square feet of medical or clinic space, 448 residential units, 65,000 square feet of flex or industrial space, and the Performing Arts Center all coming online within this midterm. I'm gonna cut to the chase here and point out to you that even through the near term, even with all this development in the pipeline, there is enough parking within the system to support this development right now. So you're good going out at least 4 years in terms of projections. You are gonna see some changes in utilization block to block and facility to facility. That's fairly typical to urban infill development. And again, it's a good problem to have. But there are no shortages that are projected going forward. There is going to, the changing in conditions is going to require, however, a little bit more aggressive management of the parking supply than has been used in the past, because as parking supply gets constrained, you have to be more proactive in managing it here. So those 34
Excuse me, Mr. Hill,
Yeah.
question.
Thank you. Well, I've actually been hitting the next button over here because I don't think your remote is working. But I'm just
Okay,
curious,
thank you.
since we've established that we're talking about public and private lots, is there a reason why we're not including the Main Street Marketplace? Because I know we've talked, when we talk about the potential for the Keefe Auditorium, using that as parking, there's a good deal of parking inventory in that complex. Is there a reason why that's not included in this area? It's just south, it's right where it says like Zone 5 there. It's a big shopping center with a pretty big parking lot.
Oh, with the Shaws?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
when we drew out the study area, we had set those as far as boundaries go. I'm not clear why that would be excluded or included per se. If I had to guess, I would say when the study area was initially defined 2+ years ago, part of the thinking was that that's a large, it's a large privately held asset here with a lot of retail focus. So the opportunities for shared use could be somewhat limited there. Retailers generally don't like to share out their supply to anybody else unless they absolutely have to.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could also
Absolutely.
just add on. So as someone that was part of the development of the boundary district here for the study, we had to draw the line somewhere. And the approach that was taken was what's walkable, what is something where reasonably someone could say that we could develop over the horizon that we're talking about in a downtown type setting. Ultimately, this kind of looked like a manageable area that could be studied, that represented what we currently have for existing conditions, and that what we believe will be, growth-oriented type development over, the next 10 or 15 or so years. If you take a moment and you think about Kinsley, and you think about the difference between Main Street, between Kinsley and the Elm Street Middle School area, Belmont Street, it's vastly different than if you go from Kinsley to the river. And so some of the logic is where do we want to define as the downtown for at least right now? I know a lot of people say the downtown is Hunt to Hunt. I know a lot of people also think of the downtown as from Kinsley to the river, or just beyond the river to Concord and Amherst Street. Naturally, the way I see the growth to occur over the next 10, 20 years is it's going to continue to go south. I think that block that was just referenced will be redeveloped in the next 20 years or so, but I believe it's very safe to kind of keep it confined to this boundary.
So those are the 34 developments that make up the study area. The keys that you see in terms of map IDs tie back to the figure on the previous slide here. The biggest takeaway that I want you to have from this here is, again, 448 residential units within the pipeline. It is the largest and most predominant land use coming through in the near term. The biggest developments that are coming through, the flats at High Street, Monahan Manor, the apartments at 249 Main Street are all residential. The only other large-scale development in the near term that's coming through is the Nashua Center for Arts. But interestingly, all of them are going to exert their biggest impact in the evenings and on weekends. So when you overlay that impact over the baseline here, what you start to see is a more intensive use going up and down the Main Street corridor here, south of Kinsley Street in some places. This is weekday impacts, and the absorption of some of the vacant space here is going to drive up demand on the far west side of the Mill District. And you can see some more intensive uses in the core of the Main Street District here. On the right-hand side, you'll notice that the blocks that are containing the Elm Street garage, Factory Street garage, and the area between them all start to climb into that orange to yellow range, which is 70+% to up to 90% utilization. So parking is becoming very tight through that area because of the developments that are coming in on a weekday evening. On a weekday, there's still, with the exception of the block that the apartments are coming in that are sitting over the former School Street, that area still has quite a bit of availability. And then if you look on the weekends, it is a much more robust and intensive use. You can see how the blocks there through the tree streets light up and become, go into that red range, that yellow range, that orange range. The higher levels of utilization, as you would expect with a lot of residential concentration. You can certainly see the impact when there's Performing Arts Center event on Block 51, which is right in the middle here. What we tried to do on a very detailed basis is go through and identify where those developments were coming in. Those are the blocks that are outlined in white. The call-outs that you see basically are reporting back to the reader what the increase is in terms of cars over baseline conditions. Those would be the blue numbers that say plus X number of cars, and then the new or adjusted utilization number after that development's impact is assessed over baseline. Now this is very detailed. Tim had warned me about going down this path, but I wanted to present this to you folks so that you could see the math that we did and know that we did our homework. In terms of the bigger story or the bigger picture, what it really ends up meaning is this. There are some blocks in some areas where you're going to start seeing a lack of available public parking at peak hours under certain conditions. There are some blocks where you're going to have very limited availability of public parking in certain areas, primarily up and down the Main Street corridor, to some degree a little bit going into the tree streets. The High and the Elm Street garages, which have typically had a lot of availability on nights and weekends, are going to start getting very full very fast, especially when there's a Performing Arts Center event. Pine Street lot is going to end up being fairly heavily leveraged on nights and weekends, which has not happened in the past because of the Monahan Manor development here and the spillover from that into the adjacent block. Because of the developments that you're seeing on the block directly across from CVS, the Maple Street lot which is right behind it, it's the closest public facility, is going to start seeing a very high level of utilization on nights and weekends. Spring Street is also going to start seeing more use on nights and weekends because of some of the residential development that's coming through and opening up in that area in the near future. Railroad Square, which has always been tight, is going to be running at capacity on nights and weekends. It's going to go from beyond tight to full for the most part. Now, that all said, we don't see anything that's spilling over. We didn't, as we laid in the demand associated with these new developments over the overlays, we didn't find any areas where there just was absolutely no parking, or you were looking at having to turn cars away. So what this means is you have enough parking, but you're gonna have to be much more aggressive about managing that and making sure that the proper incentives are in place so that there's turnover, there's availability for those discretionary users when they come in, that there's better communication to your long-term mandatory users like your residents and your employees who have to be in the area, that they have better communication and clear ideas of what their options are for placing their vehicles as well, and that there's some sort of accommodation there. But again, these are management issues. These are dealt with not necessarily by building your way out of it, by being more proactive with how you're managing what you've got right now. In terms of the impacts that you're seeing by sector, what we tried to do was measure what the changes were in terms of both utilization and adequacy. Utilization is the percentage of the supply that's being taken up or occupied. Adequacy is the number of available spaces. And you can sort of see those numbers rolling through here. We looked at it from multiple perspectives. We looked at it from a total supply perspective, and then we drilled down a little bit, looked at it just in terms of the impacts on on-street supply versus public off-street supply versus private off-street supply. So a lot of numbers up there. The most important thing that I want to point out to you folks here is when you look at the blue box that says total supply, and there's some big red numbers along one side under adequacy that show the number of available spaces declining between baseline and midterm. And then you look at the box below that with the yellow top that says public off-street supply. Most of those big red numbers are being realized in that particular segment. So a lot of the development that you have coming in on the near term is coming in, and it's being leveraged against that limited public off-street supply. And again, just to remind you, 13,000 plus spaces in downtown. Your public off-street supply represents about 25% of that total number. Your private off-street supply, again, represents about 70%. And while you are seeing some absorption there, when you look at the change in utilization, that would be the red box on the right, and you're looking at those changing utilization numbers, you'll notice that those are reading 5%, 3%, 4%, relative to the public off-street supply, which is 21%, 31%, 30%, 40%. This is where you're bearing the weight of your growth and development over the next 4 years is within this segment. And while there is enough to support it right now, things are likely to start getting very tight after that 4-year period. And I'm going to circle back just a minute and explain why I made such a big point of that. But I also wanted to jump in very quickly at midterm. Again, with the midterms, we've got 14 developments that make up the midterm. A lot of these, again, are residential. I believe 739 residential units coming in the midterm. Some of these are very conceptual and may not occur. Most of these are at least 5 years out from the current date. And again, because we're doing this on an iterative basis, assuming no proactive corrective action, this is a worst case scenario. So when you see red scary numbers up there, they don't have to be like that. I'm just trying to give you a picture of what it could look like in the future if we don't do something about this. So those developments include things like the NIMCO project, the Elm Street School project. There's a possibility of a development up at 53 Franklin Street on a parcel that's owned by Grace Fellowship Church. It's actually a parking lot. It's one of the few parking lots that might go away. There's a large parcel right next to the lofts, the other side of the river here, that Red Stab is right now soliciting interest in to do potential development there. Most of these are pretty heavy on the residential side. One of the developments, or two of the developments you're going to hear a lot about are the former Picker House and the former Old Cotton Building. Both of those are right next to or potentially part of the Clock Tower complex here. Both of them are highly underutilized buildings. They could see substantial reuse going into the future, but have no dedicated parking supply. And all of the parking supply around them is highly utilized or leveraged right now. So when we talk about those coming online, that's an area where in order to facilitate the development, you may have to do something proactive because there aren't natural resources to support that. Ditto with the 53 Franklin Street lot. So when you start laying this stuff over the top of where we left off in terms of, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
The 53 Franklin Street, is that the big parking lot just west of the church and east of 55 Franklin Street, which is the new school?
Yes, it's between those two, and it's, interestingly, I don't think it's the whole, the section that could be redeveloped isn't the whole lot, because I think there is different ownership.
So the school department's buying part of that parking lot for school use, and the apartments use one whole section of it every day for parking.
Right.
So at least 2 and possibly 3 of those sections will be busy all day long.
Yes. Yeah, and actually, you're looking at a displacement. If that parcel does go into development, you're looking at a displacement in the order of about 40 to 50 vehicles that will be displaced, plus the addition of another potentially 40 vehicles associated with a residential complex.
So you're talking about if the parking lot went away and something was built there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
not gonna happen. The school can't function without that parking, so, and the school's just being completed. So the city is not going to allow them to develop there.
All right.
In fact, the city, I think, is gonna buy part of that lot.
All right, well, we solved that. That's good, because our recommendation was if that project ever went forward, you had to create some parking specifically associated with that, because there's no place for that to go. There's no place to spill out. Part of the near term, or part of the midterm development is also the Southern New Hampshire Medical Center master plan. And as we look at how that sort of overlays across the area here, some of the major takeaways that we get from this are that, again, that 53 Franklin project, if it were to ever go forward, there's no relief valve for that right now. So there would have to be parking associated with that in order to handle both the displacement and the additional demand. The Picker Building, the old Cotton House, again, there's nothing there to support it right now. And with NIMCO coming in and potentially spilling into the Pine Street lot, which is already going to see some spillover from Monahan Manor, there's no place for those folks to go as well. So that's another one where we look at that and say, boy, we may need to accommodate that. Elm Street School, based on the plans here, is fine on a non-event basis. The only time there are going to be problems is when there are major events in the auditorium, which can seat up to 1,500 people. But there are a number of letters that are actually on record that indicate that that only happens a very limited number of times during the year. And so our thought was, rather than show those projections and say, boy, you really need to build to accommodate this, probably need to build a very good management program in order to accommodate that, rather than building a lot of infrastructure in order to accommodate that. Now, flip side, remember how I told you that the parcel across the street from CVS is going to start seeing very intensive demand that's going to fill up the Maple Street lot? Well, if the old abandoned Pentecostal building on the corner there gets purchased and redeveloped as well, now we're really in the weeds. We're really starting to get in an area where there's an issue. There may be relief right on the other side of Main Street, because Southern New Hampshire Medical Center has 3 different garages that are built into their master plan going forward. They are producing a lot of new demand because they have a lot of medical space that's coming through, but they're also providing a lot of parking as part of that plan as well. If the city could reach some sort of agreement with them, the parcel where they park, the L-shaped parcel behind the CVS where they park staff right now, has been slated for development into structured parking and a medical office building, which means during weekdays it's very busy, and on nights and weekends it's dead empty. So there may be some possibilities to leverage the development on one side of the street against some of that supply on the other, if an agreement can be put into place. Yes?
May I? Thank you. So in that regard, is there any way that we could allow, or is it economically feasible for a private landowner like the hospital to structure their parking in such a way that you have to pay to use it? Their employees could have free use. They could give them passes, but non-employees, public or other people, could pay to use that parking, so that the hospital would, or the private landowner would have would be a way of incentivizing that private landowner to allow people to park there if it was economically feasible for them to put in the infrastructure necessary to charge for the parking. Would they be able to make enough money to make it worth their while to do that?
There's a lot of questions there. Let me take them sort of one at a time. Would it be feasible? Absolutely. Could they potentially see some sort of return on their investment for putting in equipment and managing that? Yes, they could. Would it be a major profit-making enterprise, or would there be a huge profit incentive there? No, there probably wouldn't. I think that's one of the reasons that the Southern New Hampshire Medical Center heretofore has not really got into the parking business on nights and weekends. They know that they've got the availability, but they also know that they don't want to necessarily manage that. That said, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of opportunities when you're building that kind of capacity for shared use and leveraged use of those spaces when they're not under demand. And part of that could be an agreement with the city to manage part of that as a quasi-public facility during off hours. So they don't have to actually manage it. The city comes in under some sort of agreement and manages it as a quasi-public facility during off hours. There may be the possibility that some of those developers that are bringing those residentials in across the street, if there was a change in the zoning, would be incentivized to reach out to Southern New Hampshire Medical Center and say, can we establish a formalized shared use agreement for our residents as we're bringing them in here? Because now there's been a change in regulations that is going to compel us to either build or seek some sort of relief, and we'd like to talk to you about formulating that type of agreement. So there are a lot of different ways this could go, where you could see better utilization of that private infrastructure that's going to be coming through for multiple, either the benefit of multiple private parties or public-private ventures as well. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Again, in terms of trending here, I'm just going to, again, I wanted to show you that we did do all of our homework and all of our math, and the detail is right there for you to peruse at your convenience. But the real story is at the summary here, which again covers a lot of the things that I talked about here. 53 Franklin can't go forward without some sort of dedicated supply. The Picker Building, the old Cotton House projects, there's nothing there to help support them. NIMCO can go forward, but when NIMCO goes forward, any spillover beyond the planned parking associated with that is most likely going to go into the Pine Street lot, which is already kind of heavily leveraged on nights and weekends. And so that Pine Street lot could end up basically a lot that sits essentially empty on nights and weekends right now between Monahan Manor and NIMCO could be quite full on nights and weekends going forward if both those projects come forward and spill over into that. Again, you take that Pentecostal building out, you put in new development into that, especially residential development. The Maple lot is going to end up being too small to support the immediate needs around there. We can manage our way around Elm Street. Southern New Hampshire Medical Center has a very ambitious master plan, but it seems to be all self-contained. The other thing that we noticed within the Imagine Nashua plan, some of the early concepts that we saw, which implemented a road diet, could potentially take some supply that's up and down Main Street right now off the table to create other areas. We did assess that impact going through. We didn't find anybody who was going to be left out on the cold here, so to speak, but in an area that's already heavily utilized and has a lot of competition, removing up to 46 spaces potentially could further exacerbate that. And in terms of impact, you're feeling that, you're going to feel that pretty much everywhere. You are still seeing some growth in the public off-street supply, although it's not nearly as aggressive as we saw with the near term, primarily because there's just not a lot to go around. A lot more is getting felt in the private off-street supply because there are a number of projects that have planned parking supply there. You are seeing some reduction in adequacy on the on-street supply, and that is a combination really of losing potentially some of those spaces to a Main Street realignment, but that's offset by adding some spaces onto Water Street. But those Water Street spaces only come along if we're losing some capacity in La Park Renaissance. So from a net standpoint here, we're losing some public off-street spaces, we're adding some public on-street spaces, we're losing some public off-street spaces. At the end of the day, the net loss is, it's nominal as far as that goes. But this brings me to the point that I wanted to make, which is, as we talk about the transition from near term to midterm, we've reached that fork in the road. And Tim was alluding to this earlier. The question of, does the city continue to be the primary provider of parking to help facilitate economic development? Do you change your zoning ordinances in order to put some of that back onto the private development community where they come in and write those in such a way that you're also incentivizing them rather than to build parking, to potentially build other infrastructure, car share services, bicycle infrastructure, et cetera, to help move toward a more sustainable car light or car free development. The good news is we don't have to make this decision tonight. As I've said before, we've got probably 5 years before we have to start really thinking in terms of having something in place to avoid potential shortfalls. But it is a decision that Nashua's gonna have to make over the near term and make arrangements to either make plans to continue to build more parking strategically, public parking that will help facilitate that economic development, or find a way to try and share out some of that load with the private sector as they continue to promote infill development. So I'll get off my soapbox at this point. I've beaten that to death. In terms of long-term developments, there aren't that many. Most of the major developments, long-term, are actually happening just east of our study area here in the East Hollis district. There are a few potential developments that could happen within the study area. Air rights over the Telegraph building lot that sits behind it. Potential redevelopment of the Masonic building with the Santander building lot right next to it here that sees a lot of informal shared use on nights and weekends. Ditto with the Citizens Bank lot that's across the street. If the Citizens Bank parcel were to go into redevelopment, that could potentially have impact as well. In terms of those impacts, we did something a little bit different here as we started to, and there you can see the developments, and again, residential is a major piece of this. Just for those of you who are keeping score, 448 residential units in the pipeline in the near term, 739 residential units in the midterm, and then potentially another 400 in the longer term, although 220 of those are in the Nash Stellas property, which actually falls just outside of our study area, between our study area and the East Hollis redevelopment district here. But a lot of residential coming through, which I'm going to take this time to once again state, we can come up with a lot of off-street solutions, but there's going to continue to be a clamor for on-street solutions as well, which means that figuring out what we're going to do with overnight parking is going to have to be part of the solution. A lot of the long-term development is derived from the Imagine Nashua plan. The two biggest impacts coming from that Imagine Nashua plan on our study area are the changes and realignments to the Main Street corridor, and then the development of a transit-oriented district just east of the study area in the East Hollis area. And in terms of impacts, again, because this is cumulative, we tried to sort of bottom line this. If we don't do anything in the next 10 years, this is what it looks like. So where you see blue blocks with red outlines here, those are blocks where potentially utilization is at or over the capacity in order to be contained within those blocks. Again, in an urban setting, this is not unusual. It's very common to see one block that generates more demand than there is supply on that block. What you don't want to see, or what you need to be concerned about, is if you have really big numbers and you don't have a lot of availability in the adjacent blocks, or if you have a very high level of utilization or overcapacity use, and all of the blocks surrounding that are also highly utilized. And to illustrate that, I'll draw your attention here. Upper left-hand side, weekday, daytime, long-term utilization. If you look right up along the river there where the clock tower development is, that's where the Picker building and the old Cotton House come in. That could project demand in the term, well over 100 spaces more than you have available on that block. If that goes spilling over into the adjacent blocks, they're going to go into the adjacent blocks and find that those are also highly utilized. So again, there's not necessarily a lot of relief there. On the nights and weekends, again, greatest impacts that you're seeing are along that Main Street corridor. There is the potential with the loss of availability of the Santander lot, redevelopment of Citizens Bank, the Citizens Bank complex, you could actually be looking at significant shortfalls there. And then again, if that gets added to the development around the Maple Street facility, which is going to end up overparked as well, you're now suddenly looking at that cluster of 3 blue blocks right in the middle of the study area on a Saturday night that don't have enough parking to go around. Again, is this going to happen? No. That's why we're here today to talk about this. But in order to provide you some context and also talk about what we can do about it, we need to at least have some numbers to talk about. So, you know, in summary, a lot of this, you know, we've already discussed about, talked about here, the impacts that you could have. We talked about 53 Franklin, we talked about the Picker building. You have a large public benefit project coming through in the Riverwalk that unfortunately is going to be coming through at a time where the supply all along that Riverwalk is going to be highly constrained. Some of the western tree streets may very well need some options for off-street residential parking going forward. Certainly with the amount of development you're seeing the southern end of Main Street, there is going to be opportunities or a call to increase supply there. And in terms of the impacts here, it's pretty much what you're seeing by sector. You know, it's pretty much what you've seen before here. Interestingly, your utilization, your changes in utilization for the public off-street supply essentially have gone flat because all of the public off-street supply near the areas where there's intensive demand has been filled or absorbed effectively. You do see some moderate reductions in utilization that are primarily driven by the number of projects that are likely to come in with at least enough parking to accommodate the residential need. So the big question then becomes, okay, Andy, what do we do about all of this? What are our options? One of the options, as I said, was to look at how you do zoning and try and shift some of that onto the developers as they come in going forward in the future. Another option is to try and build your way out of this going forward. And we looked at a whole host of different locations where you could potentially look at going into public projects or public-private partnerships in order to build enough parking to accommodate some of these shortfalls. And in the upper right-hand side, that's the summary of existing conditions, the summary of long-term long-term impact conditions. And then the yellow boxes that you see are the locations that we looked at or assessed to potentially bring in public parking. The orange boxes are places where there may be an opportunity to do a public-private venture. And then you can see the calculations in terms of height, displacement of existing spaces, the gross capacity that could come in with each one of these projects, net capacity, and then the big numbers, which are the estimated cost and the real measure of the value of the project being the cost per net space added. I will highlight that with the Main Street, we've talked about this since day one. The idea with the Main Street would be to create additional capacity by reducing the number of lanes on Main Street and then introducing angled parking in order to get more on-street parking capacity there. However, we also understand that has a lot of ripple effects as far as that goes. So we're showing this just as a placeholder right now in an order of magnitude to measure possible impacts, at least fiscally, of that initiative relative to the other initiatives. In terms of advocacy, there are already a number of issues or a number of initiatives that are in process, including Imagine Nashua, that talk about this as a potential improvement on that. There's a lot of study that's associated with that. Some of that study in terms of traffic impact, quite honestly, is outside our area of expertise. So we tried to focus on the things that we do know, which is the structural side. And Chairman Selectman Dowd, you'll be glad to know I'm not going to walk you through every one of the next 15 slides. Those are there for your reference, but basically, if we can just go through those very quickly. Each one of these talks about the potential that you have on each one of these sites if you wanted to build structured parking. There are pros and cons to each one of these sites here. If we can roll back at one point, there are a couple of them I want to touch on here. If we can go to the Water Street, which I think is the first one. We like the Water Street site as a potential expansion site going forward for several reasons. One, it's a fairly low total project cost, and it's a fairly good cost per net space gained as far as that goes. You're introducing supply on the north end of downtown that's really going to support the Riverwalk project and take off some of the pressure that's going to be on the Elm Street and Factory Street garages. So we like this one. We think this one has some potential to really help. If you're going to spend infrastructure dollars, this is one of the sites you should be looking at. If we can go to the next slide, sir. We've talked about doing a consolidated facility where the High Street lot, the Factory Street garage are. Big dollar figure with this, very expensive from a total project cost and the cost per net space. The only way we would recommend this is if at some point it stopped making sense to invest money in extending the life cycle of the Factory Street garage.
Okay, we have Alderman Clemmons.
So, yeah, I'm looking at the number, the estimated cost that you have in there, 17.5 million, call it, for the High Street to add, and I assume it's the parking lot next to it.
Yes.
Does that 17 million include any upgrades or renovation or whatever we have to do to the existing structure that's there, or is that just in addition to?
This, when we did this, initially, what we were looking at was we knew that structure was undergoing a condition appraisal. We didn't know what the results of the condition appraisal were going to be. We were looking at different sites around the downtown and trying to figure out where we could get, for lack of a better term, the most bang for our buck, if you will. And we realized that if you could combine the floor plate that you have for that garage and the adjacent city lot right next to it, you could get a much more efficient floor plate where you could pack a lot more supply on there. If that facility, if the price tag to rehab and restore that facility and extend its life cycle was going to be expensive enough, then this might make sense, because you're spending a lot of money in order to get this development in place, but it's providing you a lot of supply in an area where there's tremendous demand. You could offset that big price tag to some degree with the money you're not spending to extend the life cycle. And when you build the new facility at this location, not only are you resetting the life cycle, but you're also looking at a design that's going to be much more durable and much more secure, friendly, and welcoming than what's there looking at.
So,
Follow up?
so is this assuming we're tearing down the existing structure and then
Yes.
building something new? And that would be 17.5 million to build something new
Yeah.
and tear down what's there?
Yes.
Interesting. What, if the city were to do that, where would everyone park?
And that's one of the major cons, is, one of the major cons on that is definitely the fact that you're displacing 361 people for the term of demolition and construction here. As opposed to something like, say, the Water Street, which is a much smaller displacement, and actually, because it's just a single level supported deck, could be done on a much quicker cycle than something like this. Like I said, this only makes sense if you decide at some point not to spend the money to extend the life cycle on the Factory Street garage. That it's just becoming cost prohibitive to continue to get that standing up. I think the potential price tag that came out of that assessment was $8 million. I'm not sure what all that includes. I'm assuming that's going to extend the life cycle on that another 25 to 30 years.
Right.
If $8 million gets you another 25 to 30 years, probably makes sense to spend that money and keep that up. If $8 million was only getting you another 10 years, then the economics of this might make more sense.
Yeah, but I would like just before, in regards to the boat parking garages, there is move currently. We're getting RFPs together and looking at it compared to the cost of replacement or fixing. Right now, they seem to be in the position that they can be fixed, but I've always said this, Nashua is a great builder, we don't take care of our infrastructure. And this is what happens. We need to watch what we currently build, maintain it, just like a homeowner does. He paints his house in a timely manner. So that's how we can save the cost factor to the taxpayers, by doing our due diligence into that regard. So there is a move. It wasn't brought into this discussion because that's a separate discussion in itself that will be presented at another particular time. But once all that information gets gathered, there will be a presentation to this board. Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, I don't think we need to get into a long discussion about it, but I don't see the Elm Street garage on this analysis. And if you could take the Elm Street garage and on the second and higher levels, go over the existing parking to the east of the garage, you would add spaces, and possibly you could even add another level to it. The downside is, with the new Performing Arts Center, where the hell are they gonna park for this? Because any one of these projects is gonna take probably about 3 years, give or take 6 months, based on what I know about building. And right now, steel is pretty expensive.
Well, and we did look at the Elm Street garage at one point. In terms of designing structured parking, ideally, you want to have something that has at least 210 feet of run. And the reason that you need something that's 210 feet tall, if you will, is so that you can put in sloped ramps that you can still park on. When you start reducing that amount of run, the slope goes up. Now you're pouring concrete for ramps that you can't actually park vehicles on. In terms of the width, we typically look in increments of 60, because 60 feet of width will get you 2 drive aisles down the middle and parking, 90-degree parking on either side. Now, you can narrow that down a little bit if you want to, angle the parking, and you can still get pretty much the same type of gain, but 60 feet of width is the sweet spot. So we looked for something that was 120, or 210, at least 210 feet long by 120 feet wide, which you have at the Elm Street garage. Those are the dimensions you've got right now. Then we said, can we get another 60 on either side of that? Because we're not sure we can extend the run on that much more, because you've got a bus terminal on one side and you've got a roadway that people need to have access to. Can we get another 60 feet going toward Main Street on the other side? And the only way we could get another 60 feet if we wanted to improve on the efficiency of that design was to close off that access roadway that runs behind the building here.
Green Street.
Huh?
Green Street.
Green Street.
Garden, excuse me. It began with a G. Okay, yeah. Garden Street.
And that's why we didn't pursue it beyond that. Because we sort of took that test and said, we're gonna have a really hard time
So
selling this.
the other thing is that 17 million, is that building it to last longer? And you also would have to somehow implement year-to-year maintenance of the garage. I just parked in that garage in Boston near the garden
Yeah.
that they're tearing down today. And that's amazing that building isn't falling down.
Oh, the government center there?
Yeah,
I can tell you some great stories.
yeah.
It's not story time yet.
The elevators are all rusted out, the steel's all rusted. So, I mean, if you were going to invest in a parking garage, you would have to build it to last, and you would have to incorporate a year-to-year maintenance cost.
But, I mean, again, when we were looking at the high Factory Street option, one of the things that we were very aware is the age of that structure and when it was built, and the technology that it was built with relative to what's available today. It's a good serviceable facility. So is the Elm Street garage, but I can tell you, based on their age, just on their age, if you were to rebuild them today, you would automatically out of the gate get a 10-year longer life cycle than when they were brand new, when they were built initially, just because of the advances in material science, the advances in engineering that have occurred between when those were built and where you're at today.
So just one follow-up, and would it not make more sense to build another garage first and then have the opportunity to tear one of these down and start from scratch? But you have to talk a long period of time, because bonding, there's a lot of things in the bonding plan right now, so this is not in the near term. But for instance, the area behind the old courthouse, if that's in here,
That's in here.
yeah, I mean, we've talked many years ago about building a parking garage on that spot. And, you know, then you could take the Elm Street garage down and reconstruct it, over a period of several years, but, if you tear one of these down now, we're in a worse position than we are
Right.
to start.
And the good news is, you don't have to do any of this right now. These are options that are available to you. What we wanted to do, though, is present some pros and cons, and more importantly, the numbers that are associated with those. With the old Cotton building, old Cotton House and the Picker building, there are really two options to potentially address that if it goes forward, that might work in that area. This option is frankly a little bit too far away to make those compelling, but we did look at the potential of a public-private venture on the critical process lot, which is just south of that location next to the Green Mill complex. Is it the Green Mill?
I'm not sure where you're going now.
The clock tower place is right here. The next, a converted mill building below that, I think, is Green Mill.
Cotton mill.
Cotton Mill.
Cotton mill. Is that what you're talking
That
about?
is it Cotton Mill? Okay.
Cotton Mill's on the other side of the river.
No, that's the other side of the
No.
river. Just
Can't
behind
be Cotton Mill.
Monahan Manor.
This is where like Just Lights is.
Yes.
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 Oh, yes.
It's Cotton Mill's on the other side of the river.
Anyway, there's a significant surface lot right there that has great dimensions as far as that goes. This could be a public-private venture, good layout, get some great gain as far as it goes. Public-private venture is always difficult. So the location is fantastic, but there's going to be some real challenges in order to go forward with this if this was a route the city wanted to go.
Okay, we have Alderman Clee, then Clemens. Alderman Clee.
Thank you. Just a correction to your slides.
Yeah.
You have one that says Pearson Street. It's Pearson Ave.
Pearson Ave.
Yeah, the residents on Pearson Street are gonna have a heart attack if they see this.
Okay.
So it's Pearson Ave. Very different location. Thank you.
Alderman Clemens.
On some of these, I noticed that there's only like, for example, three levels. Why not 4 or 5?
Basically, we were looking to see what we could get without doing massing above and beyond the buildings that are surrounding them.
Okay.
So that was one of the considerations here. For example, we only looked at three floors here because the building directly adjacent to it, I think, has a 50-foot parapet on it here. So at 3 floors, in terms of massing along Broad Street, it would be still significant, but it wouldn't be sort of this towering monolith, if you will. Ditto with the Pine Street option. That was the other option we looked at. Again, this is potentially a way to introduce more supply into this immediate area that could help that Picker Building, Old Cotton House project. It's a little bit further away. The advantage here is it's all public-owned property as far as that goes. You can get quite a bit on a 4-story structure on that site. Much like the Factory Street lot, this has some major impacts in terms of displacement during the term of construction, which need to be considered here, especially if this is being done after the NIMCO project and some of the other projects that are happening in the area. We're already looking at potentially displacing the people who work in the buildings surrounding this site during the day and the overflow from Monahan Manor at night. And then if the NIMCO project comes on, then we're also displacing those folks.
Correct me
So
if I'm wrong with it, the higher you go, the more intense the base and the larger the steel to support the weight,
there
which
is,
drives cost.
interestingly enough, there's a sweet spot. Up to a certain level, and again, it depends on the floor plate, but up to a certain level, the incremental cost to go up another floor is actually fairly small.
Boy.
Until you get, for a lot of these designs we're looking at, once you start looking at anything over 6 stories, you're now going to have to look at the type of retrofit for spread footings, for columns, et cetera, that's going to start to really pile up those costs as far as it goes. The other thing, just from a functional standpoint, is these are all fairly small and compact floor plates. you only want to go up so many because you've got to spin down as well. And if you go up 10 and spin down 10, by the time your users get to the bottom, they're going to be seasick. So there's some functional considerations. There are also some considerations in terms of tidal movements, although none of these are venue driven like you would get at the Garden here. But you're still going to have a lot of localized traffic spilling out of these, and part of the question is, what is that going to do to the road network?
Mr. Hill, I would like to change gears a wee bit.
Yes, sir.
You are absolutely correct. It's been somehow unofficially dumped on us, the board, Nashua taxpayers, to solve the problems of parking issues, while landlords seem to be walking around, somewhat scot-free. They're not responsible for providing any type of additional type of parking. I know Ms. Stansfield has had several issues with several people, even changing illegally addresses and everything else like that. So I'm going to tease your brain into communities that have changed the zoning ordinance. How has that worked out, and is there any benefit that you can see for a city like Nashua to throw it back to zoning, to change the zoning regulations to look to assist us with the parking? It's a loaded question.
It is a loaded question, and I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this.
Politically correct.
It is not uncommon for municipalities to, quote unquote, get into the parking business at some point, which is to say waive their parking requirements and in order to invite development to come in. You're removing a barrier to development. And when you have a lot of supply that's underutilized or unutilized, it only makes sense to try and bring that development in to leverage against an asset that you've already bought and you're continuing to pay for in terms of maintenance, in order to get that momentum going. Most communities reach a point, however, where the supply starts to run out, and the question then becomes, do we want to get even more intensive into the parking business? Do we want to get out of the parking business completely and get into the transportation business? Or do we want to start sharing some of that load with private development?
Right, see, I'm more referring to situations where a landlord will rent a building, a studio apartment, to some gentleman, but then he finds Sweetie Pie, who comes in with a car. He also has another car that's a collector that he works on the weekends. So now he's up to 3 cars.
Right.
And we're seeing situations exactly like that. And the building was originally built as a 2.5-story wood frame for 2 families who didn't have a car.
So unfortunately, when you talk about revising your ordinances here, there comes a point where a community basically waived parking requirements. Now they're going to reinstate them. Typically, they're going to reinstate them as an incentive for folks to engage in a lot of other initiatives that really help the city's objectives. But you can't retroactively go back and put that on everybody who's come in. So typically what ends up happening is you draw a line and you say, everything before this time is grandfathered, everything hereafter this is applicable to.
It would have to be that way. It goes by the point of sale of the property from henceforth would be, right.
Now,
fairness to everybody.
Yeah. Now, that said, with the example that you're talking about here, the only reason that property owner is engaging in this behavior right now is because they've had the ability to. There's been available and adequate supply that's been cheap or at no cost to them whatsoever. And so it's been a no-brainer that, I'm gonna add this car, that car, et cetera, to the property, and it's not gonna be an issue. As you continue to grow, you get more competition for available spaces downtown. You start to charge a fair market rate for the services that you're providing, which elevates the market, which then potentially brings in private competitors as well. All of those things are going to work to discourage those behaviors at that time, because it's not a no cost, no hassle behavior to have an excessive number of vehicles associated with a property. Now it's becoming truly problematic. Can you address that through zoning? Absolutely. You can address that through zoning retroactively and change your zoning ordinances to say going here forward. But most cities solve that issue by letting market conditions that come from a growing, prospering, competitive parking market coming into the area create the pressures that actually cause those folks to rethink some of their behaviors or activities.
All right. Alderman Clegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hill. Everything that you say, I agree, I understand with, and then everything that Director Cummings had said at the beginning of the meeting, and the speaker that you did not get to hear, who kind of brought things forward. All of these things sound wonderful. I would love to see a more walkable, bike-friendly downtown. But I can't see that happening if we continue to build homes, units, however you want to do it, whether it's rental or so on, and we don't have the adequate parking to go with it. I don't want to get into the parking business. I would love to get in the transportation business, but the reality is right now, we have a transportation issue, not just commuter rail, but we're having problems with our bus situation where we can't hire people and so on. Hopefully, we can resolve that in the next couple of years. But while that's happening, we're having these potential 448 units coming online. And I see this as a balancing act that we can't do it all. We can't make it a walkable and bike-friendly and close off Main Street type thing, which makes perfect sense to have this nice, wonderful village that people come and we're very unique, kind of like downtown. How do you balance that? To me, I don't want to get in the parking business. I'd love to be in the transportation business. I only see that unless we change our zoning and we do it soon, we are going to have a lot of units. And I can tell you just from my ward alone, we had a large house. They divided into five different apartments. They did the 1.5 per, and then made one of the apartments have 5 bedrooms. You know, a 5-bedroom apartment has at least 3 to 5 cars. So this is what I foresee downtown. And just because people live downtown doesn't mean that they work downtown. They're gonna work in Boston, they're gonna work Hollis, Amherst, and so on. They're going to need cars. And I don't think this area has the commuter infrastructure. So what is a recommendation? Do you foresee doing the zoning changes?
My recommendation is to change zoning. And I talked about this last time, the presentation I went last time. I'm not going to reiterate all of that again, but very top of the waves. Reinstituting minimum parking requirements that are appropriate for the market, not that are onerous, but are appropriate for the market to make sure that there's enough parking there to support a development, creates a stick, okay? It does create a little bit of a barrier to development, but it also creates an incentive for the developer to look at ways to seek relief. Those different ways to seek relief can include things like negotiating a shared use agreement with an abutting private property owner to say, hey, I'm building 10 residential units over here. I know in the middle of the day, I'm only going to need 5 parking spaces to support this, but overnight I may need 12. Are you willing to enter into an agreement with me so that I can use 7 of your spaces on nights and weekends when your office building is sitting empty? And if they can come in and they can submit that agreement, they get a 7-space waiver on, that requirement that they would have under the minimum parking requirements. Or maybe they bring in bicycle facilities and based on, what they're doing in terms of improvement there, maybe they get a space or two off there. Maybe they come in and they say, I don't want to do any of that. Okay, that's fine. We've set up an in lieu fee. You don't have to provide your full requirement, but you do need to pay the city X number of dollars per space for the waiver that goes into a fund that then goes into something like this. It creates a revenue stream so that as the city still has to keep a foot in the parking business, they're at least doing it with some sort of revenue to drive that. I can go on and on about the other incentives, but basically what happens is the minimum parking requirements create the stick. All of these incentives create the carrots to either make better use of the assets that you have available to you right now, or to start investing in alternative transportation. So that as your bus system gets more robust, as you add in major bicycle networks, et cetera, some of that is already built into some of these projects to really help those initiatives flower.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Follow up?
Thank you. The reason that I asked this was there's an incredible group in Nashville that's just kind of getting started. It's a fledgling group that's really working to create a walkable and so on. And they're very strong advocates for this. And I think they have some wonderful ideas. They're looking at some communities. The wonderful person who spoke earlier, she's part of that group and so on. And I've been hearing from them. And I'd like to be able to give them kind of what they want. So now that you say this, if we do get the minimum parking and we do, those that come in have to do a deal as you said or something like that, would that help also eliminate some of that used parking on Main Street, or can this solution help to get to that? Or are they just completely different?
Can you clarify, what do you mean by that?
Well, that of the walkable, the creating a better downtown, even what you had said at the beginning of the meeting for a village type thing, partial closing of Main Street and so on, getting the cars off of Main Street. Would something like this help to get the cars? I mean, I know that if we could build the appropriate roads on the outside of Main Street, we could get them off Main Street. And that's a whole nother discussion that I'm not going to put on you, but.
May I, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you may.
Yes, so all the strategies that Mr. Hill just outlined are strategies that would ultimately lead you to a walkable downtown.
Wonderful.
And it's based on the built environment that you want. And I completely understand, if you can kind of think about it, the last thing you would want in your downtown or your inner core is like strip development, where you have a parking lot and a building, and buildings are set far away from each other. And so as you advance your urban design and your aesthetic and what you want, you are going to start to adopt these types of strategies to get that infill development that you want, building on the parking lots, building on that surface parking lot. And everything that Mr. Hill is talking about, advanced communities are using as tools to leverage the opportunity, so it's not solely borne on the taxpayer, but the development and the private sector community, as they're coming in, look to complement one another. And so that's the thought process and strategy behind it. And Mr. Chairman, if I may just take another moment.
Please.
The comments that we heard earlier tonight are wonderful comments, and I completely agree with them. I think what should be also recognized in this group, whether official or unofficial, what they should be very proud of is Nashua has been at the forefront of some of these more smart growth urban principles, way ahead of the rest of the country. And at the time we needed that maybe to induce the private sector market that at the time was lacking. But now all we're talking about is a recalibration where with some of these tools that we're talking about this evening and instituting that stick, that, you know, we would be able then to, again, come to we're in basically a new phase, a new evolution of our downtown redevelopment. And so this is how we can recalibrate it. And anything we do now, I would suggest, would not be forever, should never be in perpetuity. Your zoning should be a dynamic type of land use code where you're constantly reevaluating it. And after now and 5 years from now, you look at it, you see how you do, how things are going, you reassess. Could we come back here and recalibrate some of what we're talking about this evening? Absolutely.
Thank you.
Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, it's a question for Director Cummings. It's my understanding from talking to Director Sullivan that we're either in the midst of or approaching a complete revision of our land use code.
That's correct, Alderman Dowd.
So are we dovetailing these two things together so that one doesn't go in one direction, the other goes in the other?
Well, Director Sullivan and I work very closely together, and I know he has been intimately involved in this project, and everything we're talking about here, he's well aware of. Plus, everything we're talking about here follows along suit with the Imagine Nashua master plan that we've adopted. What they're doing right now is going to be the technical verbiage that would be the regulatory language that would govern the Imagine Nashua plan, and would be guided by, I should say, the Imagine Nashua plan. And everything here in this study tonight also does the same.
Okay, at this time, are there any further questions of Mr. Hill?
Mr. Chairman, there's
Sure.
one thing on here this evening that I really want to kind of touch upon as well, and because it's an option that's near and dear to my heart, and I want to just kind of talk about it for a quick second, and that's the Pearson lot option.
Pearson Ave.
And it's technically Pearson Ave. And so similar to the Water Street concept, you know, I'm trying to be mindful how we can most efficiently provide additional supply to maximize our source, and also try to enhance the downtown. This might be a creative solution in doing that, where we would look at the Pearson Street Avenue as a potential place to increase supply. And I wanted to kind of point that all out to you. I didn't want this to go by without pointing this out as well.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Alderman Clement.
Can I just ask a question? In regards to the Pearson Street lot, isn't there a privately
Pearson
owned,
Ave.
isn't there a privately owned parking space there that's deeded that would have to be taken care of in order to do something like this?
That's where the towing is.
And I'm going to clarify that, if I could, Mr. Chairman. So you said very specifically a space. And so there is, ironically enough, one space that is deeded to an individual. We haven't gotten to a level of design. Could we, because it's actually right on the peripheral, could we maybe exclude that one space? We could look at that. I'm not going to say yes, I'm not going to say no, but because we might be able to set it back a little bit. But there is a private sector land that this is contemplating developing on. And so to be more specific, we would definitely need the private sector land on Pearson Ave to be able to execute on this concept.
Okay, so there'd be two issues there. Okay.
Good, Alderman Jettie.
Thank you. Just for clarification, as we look at the Pearson Avenue lot option, so in these photos, where's the river? Is the river on top or?
The river's on top, yes.
On top?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I don't see the building, 60 Main Street building. Where is that on here?
Top left corner of the picture should be. Main Street would run along the left,
Yeah.
and then like the library would be up and to the right.
Pearson Ave is right next to the old Telegraph building.
Okay, so could I ask a follow-up?
Yes, you may.
So this garage, would it be on the 60 Main Street parking lot or on the south side of Pearson Ave?
It would be on the south side.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else? No?
No, thank you. I just would be remiss
Okay.
not to.
I'm going to ask the committee, Mr. Hill, you're planning to come before us again? Director Cummings jump in here for scheduling purposes?
I think Mr. Hill had just a couple more slides he wanted to get through, particularly the implementation.
Yes.
So
Oh, okay,
if
I'm
we
not
could-
cutting you off, I mean,
Yeah, well, I made a liar of myself when I promised Mr. Dowd that I wouldn't go through all the slides, and then immediately I started going through all the slides. So,
We did skip a couple.
Yeah, we did skip
so
it.
just to summarize, all of the options are in here. The two, in the near term, again, management is the key, not necessarily building. In the midterm, if you're gonna build Water Street and Pearson Avenue, both have low project costs, low net per space gain costs, and they would service a lot of the needs on the north end of downtown. The bookend to this is the Maple Street site. If that starts to go forward, the Maple Street site has some great potential possibilities there, among other things dimensionally. If the Pentecostal building came down and you could enter into an agreement with that property owner, you could put a single deck on the back side of that site away from Main Street and still have enough room on that site in the front to do a residential building, which is the hatched area that you see right there. This is what's called a wrapped garage. It is becoming the new hip way to do parking because you're basically putting a very appealing and aesthetically appealing land use on the face of this, facing toward Main Street, and you're hiding the garage essentially on the back side of this here. You still get a very effective and efficient garage to service that development, but you're putting a nice face on it and a higher, better use on the other half of the property. This is something that somebody who acquired that Pentecostal building might be very interested in, because they might find that this structural grid is more efficient and attractive for them to build on than the Pentecostal building. So this is one of these places where a public-private venture could really work out very nicely. It would create a reservoir for the south end of downtown that could not only service the residential developments going there, but also as a spillover from performing arts center events as well here. So it creates, again, a publicly held asset at the south end of Main Street to sort of bookend things in the midterm. And in terms of cost, you know, there's a significant project cost associated with this, but on a cost per net space gained, it's actually the lower end of the scale relative to a lot of the other options that we looked at. In the longer term, you know, we already kind of put to bed 53 Franklin Street. If we're talking about supporting Picker Building, the old Cotton House, again, critical process site and Pine Street lot are probably the two best locations here. In a longer term here, if there's development that comes in and there's a need on the south end of downtown, either negotiating with Southern New Hampshire Medical Center for a shared use agreement there, or negotiating with the developer that eventually acquires the Citizens Bank site, would probably be your best bet from a strategic standpoint in order to service the needs you have at the southern end of Main Street. So, with that said, the challenge now becomes, I've held you hostage for two 2-hour sessions so far and dumped a lot of stuff on you. And the question then becomes, how do we actually put this together in an implementation plan? And that's what we're trying to get to right now. So there were 5 guidelines that we used as we talked about this implementation plan. You can see them up there. It really comes down to establishing a mission and making sure that everything you do reflects the mission for the parking system. Wherever you can, starting initiatives that forward fund improvements and initiatives that you have going forward here. So that you're doing things at a revenue neutral or revenue positive standpoint rather than trying to play catch up, spending money that you don't have. Making sure that, I'm gonna use a different vernacular for 3, but making sure that you're very clear on what the rules of the game are before you start holding people accountable to them. That's critical for enforcement. Whatever you do, it is a best practice to define the metrics that you're going to judge whether it's a successful initiative from upfront, do some data collection while you're doing it, and then report back to the community. This is what we said we were going to do, these were our objectives, this is how we measured success, this is what the metrics were at the end of the day. Never forget that what you have is a public asset, and you ultimately have to be communicating back to the public what you're doing with that asset. And finally, as we talk about technology, when we talk about investments in technology, which is very expensive, make sure that whatever you're investing in is getting you great data back about how your system is being used and utilized, as well as enhancing efficiency and making it more customer friendly. Because the more data you have coming in, the smarter Jill and her team will be when it comes to making policy going in the future, and the less often you'll have to bring somebody like me back in to hold you hostage for multiple hours. So, with that said, and those principles in hand here, really set out to say, okay, if I were doing this with all of the recommendations that I would made, how would I approach this? And I tried to initially break it down into fairly digestible chunks. So in the first year, the first thing I would do is have Jill and Tim and whoever else sit down and very clearly define what the mission of the parking system, public parking system is, whether it is to be profitable, to operate in a revenue neutral, to facilitate downtown development, whatever that's going to be. Define that, put in a mission statement, publicize it, so that that becomes sort of the defining theme that drives all your other decision making going forward. Now you actually know why you're doing what you're trying to do, and it will help inform the rest of the process. We talked about this a little bit. We are recommending that you look at establishing the parking department as part of an enterprise fund. So it's self-contained. It makes reporting easier. It helps with transparency. So when you talk about doing things that are very politically unsavory at a future date, like changing rates, the system is set up in such a way that anybody in the public purview that wants to come in and see why you're asking to do this can find those items within the budget documents. I'm also going to make Jill do an annual report as well, so that'll be part of it, but it'll make doing that annual report easier. But just going to that new financial structure will help a lot with what we're trying to do. The next step is to look at implementing those meter rate adjustments. You haven't changed meter rates since 2022?
2012. The meter rates were 2011.
2011, okay.
The lease parking rates were 2002, I believe.
So those were 2002. Okay, so
It's time.
it's overdue, as we noted in a lot of the observations that we had. The rates that you have in place right now are not necessarily getting the turnover that you're looking for. They're not influencing user behavior. You don't necessarily have a lot of people to throw at it from an enforcement standpoint. So one of the ways that you can start influencing behavior, creating availability, helping folks to redistribute their demand voluntarily according to their price sensitivity, is by changing those meter rates, and again, it future funds some of the other development that you're looking at, some of the other initiatives that we're looking at here. In terms of getting back to the ground rules and the ordinances here, we talked about making some significant structural revisions to chapter 320 within the ordinances that talks about all things parking and transportation. The two things that we said we do right off the bat were to pull out all of the ordinances that are under parking meters right now that deal with parking permits and make parking permits a whole new article or chapter in and of itself. And also pull out all the stuff about the downtown improvement committee that's under parking meters and make that a standalone article itself. Just because of those two things, for reference sake, really want to stand on their own and not necessarily be a subset to parking meters. I understand why that was done, when it was done, but your permit system is going to evolve rapidly over the next few years. It, for lack of a better term, deserves an article of itself. As part of that process, when you pull permits out and you create the new article for that, that's a good time to start looking at implementing some of the recommendations that we made for restructuring that parking permit program as well. You're rewriting the ordinances anyhow. This is as good a time as any to make those changes as you're rewriting and revising those ordinances. And again, the revenue that's going to come from that will help forward fund some of the stuff that you need to do later on, and it will also help change user behaviors and create a better distribution of demand across the public supply that you've got. And that's just year one. So when we go to year two, again, it's public asset. It's important to report back to the public. So my first recommendation in year two is to establish a citizens advisory committee to talk with the parking department about the changes that they're making and give them some sort of voice to meet with the folks who control parking. Some of these are fairly easy pickups. I think I made some reference to chapter 74, which actually talks about administrative enforcement. That's on your books right now. And it's a fairly easy fix to go in and just note that the limitations that are stated in that are applicable to other ordinance violations, but not necessarily also applicable to parking ordinance violations here. Before you can start really talking about doing anything to step up enforcement, the first thing you need to do is fix towing ordinances. And I gave you a whole laundry list. I don't know if any of you have read the report yet. It's riveting.
It's all riveting.
But there's a long list of things that could be changed in chapter 306. The biggest thing I would say in chapter 306 is to start publishing the rates that are associated, especially if you're using a third party, private party for towing, for impound, for storage. Start publishing those rates someplace where people can go and find them. It'll have a prohibitive effect, if you will, when folks actually know the cost associated with some of the decisions that they're making. Once you've got that set in place, now it's time to go back and look at Article 15, which really talks about violations and penalties. We spent a lot of time, last time I met with you, talking about restructuring and streamlining the fine system here and then updating the fine structure as well. This is the time to do that when you're doing those revisions here. And then the last thing that I would do is look into gating the Elm and the Factory Street garages for three reasons. One, at this point, we still haven't hired up any more enforcement people. We know we're understaffed. So by gating those facilities, at the very least, we've taken two facilities off that are not enforcement dependent anymore. We know that those facilities are both going to see elevated use between the flats and the Performing Arts Center and some of the infill developments here. So making them more secure, more friendly, more user-friendly. And also Equipping them, finally, my item number 3 is equipping them with equipment that's going to feed data back to the city about how they're being utilized so that you can make better decisions going forward and better manage those facilities. All make, I believe, for compelling argument for putting in gated parks in those facilities. That's hopefully already funded by some of the other changes that you've made heretofore in the system. If Jill's still talking to me after year 2 and year 3, this is when hopefully we've resolved all of the questions regarding overnight parking and been able to establish whatever that program's going to be. To get ahead of those residential units that we believe are coming in the near term and the midterm. This is also a good time to look at converting. I gave you a whole laundry list of block faces that should be converted over to the next level of regulation, if you will, going forward. This is a good time to do that as well. Before we can start really getting more effective with management, the first thing we've got to be able to do is be able to track what we are doing with management and enforcement. The parking department is overdue for an upgrade in the existing software system that they've got. This is the time to make that upgrade as well. And then once we have all of those pieces in place and we've got a revenue stream coming in, now let's start staffing up for being a more aggressive management body by adding those people on the operations side, on the maintenance side, on the enforcement side, to get that department fully geared up in order to be the effective management agency you're going to need for parking in the future. And then as part of that initiative to be more proactive, also establish this monthly working group of different agencies that are associated with parking, fire, DPW, economic development, et cetera, to start that regular conversation, those updates as well. Which brings us to year 4. In year 4, now that we've got the meter set, now that we're equipped to actually do enforcement, now is a good time to look at replacing the existing meters.
Can I,
Yes, sir.
may I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Are they gonna last that long?
That's a good question.
It's a serious question, because the ones that we have now are, what, 30 years old,
20.
20 years old? And we have to cannibalize other ones that we take out to get parts and things like that. So I don't know if maybe that should be moved up in the timeline.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm doing this as a, if I were in charge and were a perfect world exercise.
Okay.
In reality, some of these things are going to be multi-year processes, and you may end up doing some of it earlier rather than later.
Okay.
For example, if you're going to start revising your existing zoning regulations, I know I told you had about 5 years before you had to start worrying about that. That doesn't mean you should start in year 4, probably.
Right.
But that seemed to be a good placeholder in terms of we've taken care of all of these other management things. Now we can start looking at planning initiatives and the infrastructure questions. Ditto with updating and formalizing all the parking department SOPs. That's something that's going to be happening over multiple years. Again, the reason that we talk about doing this is so that we know there's going to be turnover, so that there's good transfer of information. Training happens very quickly. Folks get up to speed. So now that we've actually done all this investment in the department, we can make sure that if there is turnover, it's not necessarily hurting provision of services here. Somewhere in here, again, sitting down with the ordinances and really defining what the powers of the parking director are, versus this committee versus the Board of Aldermen, getting that all down so that there's a clear idea for where division of responsibilities are. That can happen earlier, it can happen later. I was so worried about other things this sort of app ended up as a 4-year initiative. But at the end of the 4 years, again, you will have now upgraded or changed your meter rates in year 1, your permit rates in year 2, your fine rates in year 3. In year 4, this is the time to go back and revisit all of those. And hopefully the way we've done it is before we change those, we've communicated to the public why we're changing them, what we're going to be assessing as far as metrics of success, whether it's to make sure that every block face is 85% utilized, 85% or less utilized peak hour here. We've collected that data, so we're in a place now to inform the public so we can go in and do this rate review. And we're doing this rate review not necessarily because, oh my God, we need to raise more money. We're doing this rate review because we're saying, do we need to adjust the rates in order to meet the objectives we laid out with mission statement in year 1? And we're also getting the public used to the idea of revisiting this on a regular basis rather than an every 10 to 12 year basis when things reach a crisis point. And that takes us out through year 4. As we talk about getting into the midterm here, there are still a lot of revisions that can happen in Chapter 320. A lot of it's just fly specking and cleanup stuff, which is why it can wait up to 4 years. I think you're going to have more than enough to do in the first 4 years, so it can wait. By the time we're 4 or 5 years out from where we're at right now, even here in Nashua, you're going to start to really see pressure from the public to provide more EV charging infrastructure. There are initiatives that are coming down the line every day that make this more affordable, that make it cheaper for municipalities to invest in this. It's not something you need to necessarily do today based on the presence of EVs that you have in town, but within the next 15 years, the way they're projecting sales and absorption rates, even here in southern New Hampshire, EVs are going to be 10 to 15% of the rolling fleet out there. And so we're going to start looking at your parking garages and your parking lots. It's not just parking facilities, but also refueling facilities. So this is a good time to start looking at formalizing and expanding that network here. If you're going to start building, this is also a good time to start looking at initiating those recommended projects to add parking infrastructure, Water Street deck, Pearson Avenue deck, and the Maple Street garage. Again, this whole strategy of bookending Main Street north and south to create reservoirs at either. And then in the long term, a lot of it depends on the decisions you make with regards to zoning and how your downtown grows. I tried to do the best job I could do to project where you're going to go over the next 10 years. If I could do that with 100% reliability, I would be in a different line of business. But we talked about a lot of things here that you may very well want to start looking at this point in time here. You will have got the management pieces all in place. You may have potentially expanded the parking infrastructure as well. So in the longer term, 7 years and out, this is when you can start looking at more strategic initiatives. Do we want to approach Southern New Hampshire Medical Center and start getting into some public-private sharing agreements with them in order to help buttress the south end of downtown, and also potentially prepare for backfill from the East Hollis TOD network as it comes back this area and you see back infill moving back toward this area. Depending on what's happening with Citizens Bank, that may be another site to look at for public-private venture here. Again, the old Cotton House, the Picker Building, are a question mark. Is that happen in 4 years? Does it happen in 7 years? Does it happen in 15 years? You have within the Imagine Nashua plan, as well as a lot of other studies that we read at the start of this, a lot of complete street projects that are coming down the line. Complete street projects are great because it improves walkability. It improves access by other means. And parking plays a role in that. So the question is, what kind of role can parking, once parking gets their own house in order, for lack of a better term, what kind of more aggressive strategic role can they play in that? Two things to consider that we saw a lot of other communities do that you're not doing right now, but you may want to think about taking on in the longer term. One of them would be booting as an alternative to towing for enforcement here. Also, once we get over the hump of the overnight parking program, one of the things to consider is when Albany went to an overnight parking program, residential parking program, Portland, Portsmouth, all of them also tried an alternate side of the street variation on this that helped with things like snow removal, periodic street cleaning, etc. Once you get your overnight program fixed, then we can further complicate it by now looking at the alternate street options as well. And folks, if Nashua continues to grow the way they are, and we get to the end of 10 years and you've done everything on this list, there'll be a whole set of new challenges to deal with. Parking is the gift that continues to give. And
it doesn't go away.
But this will hopefully get you at least through the first decade.
Alderman Wilshire.
All very interesting stuff, a lot to think about,
Yes, ma'am.
but thank you. Very, very interesting.
Okay, Alderman Clemmons.
Yeah, I want to just also thank you for coming these last 2 meetings and presenting this and all the hard work that went into it. I didn't agree with everything, but I agree with 90% of it, and I think we have a lot of work to do, so.
Alderman Jettie.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly to clarify, I still don't understand what the critical process garage location is. Is that, I'm looking at the tax map now, and so you've got Clock Tower Place. and then-
Clock Tower Place is to the north.
Yeah,
As you come south, there's an access way just north of the building that I keep wanting to refer to as the Green Mill Building. And
yeah,
apparently
it's
that's
the Green
not-
Brick Mill LLC.
Green Brick Mill, thank you. Okay,
Okay.
so that is the right building. So the Green Brick Mill Building runs parallel to Clock Tower Place. And then when you come just the other side of that, there's this surface lot at the other end of, is it One Chestnut?
Yep,
Yeah,
Right there. Yep.
that's it.
that's what we keep referring to as the critical process lot.
Okay, thank you.
Because critical process is in the building right behind it.
They're the major tenant.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Mr. Cummings. Got a lot of information, like Alderman Wilshire has said. We're not gonna bite this, right off the bat. So looking for suggestions for this committee and moving forward. Should we book it another, a month out, the next,
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest maybe your next meeting, it doesn't need to be a month from now, but the next time the group wants to get together. What I was going to recommend is basically taking this, really focusing on years 1 through 4, and looking to see how we might be able to bundle some of these things into achievable type of increments for discussion purposes. to see if there's consensus to move forward. Some of the items that were kind of outlined in year one, we can accomplish that in relatively short order. And then the question is do we want to try to move this for this fiscal year coming up, or do you want to wait a year to the following fiscal year? That's going to be some of the direction I'm going to be looking for at the next, at the next meeting.
Yeah,
We kind of.
I know you asked for the next meeting, but I'll just remind everybody, once this cat comes out of the bag, you're never getting the cat back in the bag. So this thing needs to be pretty resolved by the time we implement the program. I mean, there might be some tweaking, however, the majority of it needs to be done. Alderman Clemens and Alderman Dow.
Thank you. So to me, there's two big initial things, I guess, for me. And I don't know which one is the cart and which one's the horse. But one is the sort of the administrative stuff that has to get done. And I don't know if that is done behind the scenes or if that's better done here. But the other one is figuring out how much, because we want to make this thing revenue neutral, right? So it's figuring out, I guess, what those priorities are, and then backing into that number of, okay, it's going to cost this much money to do X, Y, and Z. Here's what we intake now. How do we get to that level? And I think, so I don't know what, and that's probably going to be a process, right? Because we're going to have to decide what priorities we want and what the rates are going to have to go to, and how do we figure that out? And I can't imagine we're going to get that done in a meeting.
No, I think that's going to take a year discussion.
Right.
I mean, that would, but starting with the mission statement, starting with more of the administrative things, which is the back of the house, is I don't know what it would take to transition to an enterprise fund. We've started to discuss it internally. Our finance team seems relatively optimistic that it's something that could be done, but of course that's if this body elects to move in that direction. So we're going to need to hear, that affirmative affirmation. Just doing those two things alone, and then building out the business plan that I think you were just discussing, Alderman Clemens, is exactly what I would think would be like the, next summer, fall type conversation, which wouldn't be this fiscal year, into the following fiscal year, which is let's see where there's consensus for where the revenue can land at based on some conservative projections. See what expenses we can accommodate from that. If that seems reasonable, then we would, obviously look to start putting forward some legislation. I think that's a year-long conversation, just that in and of itself.
Yeah, I would like to interject too also. We're coming into budget season. This is March, wrapping down to the end of March. We've got to come in, Alderman Dowd he'll schedule the budget hearings, but from what my experience have been on budget for like 6-7 years is a couple of meetings a week and the like and everything. So different, I would like to give this committee maybe a little bit of a break until it may be after the budget, which may be given enough time for people to start thinking and discuss amongst yourselves and different things of where you want to be with this, and call it by the wrap of the budget season. Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, I was going to mention the budget season, but March is kind of tight right now, but April and May, June, going to be impossible to schedule other meetings, so you need to cover as much as you can in the meetings that are already on the docket.
Right.
The other thing is, are any of these items that we talked about tonight in this plan on the capital improvements plan?
Yes.
That's good, because that would be one place to start. And the other thing is where they fall on the capital improvements plan. The other thing is that once it gets to a point where it's a viable project, you gotta get into the bonding plan and see where it fits. Because there are a lot of people ahead of you on, including some of your own projects, Dr. Cummings. So, you know, you can't tackle a major bond program without getting it in the plan. Because as you know, we try to keep the debt service as kind of level as much as possible, so. Something to think about.
Yes, thank you, understood.
Okay, so without objection, what do we think of maybe, I'll talk to our legislative administrative assistant, start shooting for maybe in April, if there's time available, April. But that'll give, I think, the infrastructure committee, PEDC, to start paying attention to the regular type of day-to-day operations that the constituents demand us to focus on as well. So we'll shoot for tentatively April. It may be pushed back from that date, depending upon what's happening with the budget. So everybody in somewhat of agreement. Don't worry, I won't forget you. You know, we'll get to this. So if that sounds like a plan. So that being the case, Mr. Cummings, I know you'll be at a beck and call if somebody comes up with a question, but what about Mr. Hill? To take phone calls from Mr. Hill through you?
Yes, if I could, Mr. Chairman, please, just so we can manage the consultant's time and expense, yes, cost. If you could funnel everything through myself, we will triage it and then get it off to him for his comment and then back to you all.
Sound like a plan? Okay. All right. Anybody else have anything else that they want to, as far as target? Director Cummings?
Yeah, I actually, since you brought it up, I just want to make sure, we did put a call out for comments, questions. To date, we've only had one member of the Board of Aldermen submit something to us. So if anyone does have any questions on our address, please get them into me. I'd love to bundle them into a package and get them off to the consultant. There's no time sensitivity here per se, so if you could get them into me over the next few days, happy to get them off.
Okay, Alderman Klink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have two kind of questions that they may be addressed in the plan, but is signage as to where parking is located part of the whole grand scheme of everything? Because that's one of the things that we have a lot of parking that people don't understand exists. I mean, people say to me, I couldn't find any parking. I'm like, I go park over in the taxi lot. You know, it's metered, they don't even realize that that's there. So is signage to help people, not just the big parking lots, but parking in general?
We did not take a lot of time to really look at signage as part of our scope of work. In part because the city had just engaged in a fairly extensive wayfinding study, and a lot of the things that we would have recommended as part of our assessment were already in that wayfinding study in terms of recommendations. My understanding is not necessarily that the recommendations don't exist, they just haven't necessarily all been implemented at this point.
But there were some recommendations, Mr. Chairman, that are in Mr. Hill's report that I think are worth noting, like the parking department developing a brand, developing some consistent signage or colors to help carry that message forward. And obviously signage would also be another element of that.
I'd just like to comment to that, and then I have one other question. We do have on our website parking where people can park and so on, but they just don't see it when they're driving around. They're new to the town and so on. So I do think we do a good job, but obviously could do better. Yes. And the EV charging stations, I'm completely feel that we need to get those in and so on. Are they free or are they pay for? They're pay for, correct?
There was a very brief window when you could get free EV charging right after the VW diesel settlement.
Yep.
And The line of people that set up to get those was slightly shorter than the free beer line at Fenway Park on a July day. That said, there are a lot of incentives right now. Some of them are actually baked into the federal infrastructure bill that's going through process right now. And I know that there are sections within that talk about the process for appealing for grants for municipalities in order to get that. At the state level, at the federal level, there are grant monies, there are loan monies. Interestingly, if you hook up with your local utility provider, they often have the inside track and may offer rebates as well for investing or installing those type of things. So there are ways to mitigate the cost of that substantially.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I think I probably didn't make myself quite clear. I figured that we had to pay for them,
Yeah.
but the users, is there a user fee for it? Because so
Yeah.
often people say, you should just make these available to anybody to encourage them to do it. I have an issue with that. No one's paying for my gas. I don't think we should pay for their charge.
Our recommendation to clients, Desmond's recommendation to all of our clients at this point is even if you don't charge for electric parking or for electrification in parking facilities right now, start, even if it's a nominal fee, even if it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour. We have an analogy in the parking industry we like to refer to as the frog in the pot analogy. And it's much easier to turn the temperature on the pot up a little bit if you've already had it at a low simmer than trying to start from scratch. The fact is, when a lot of these got installed, there was very limited demand for it. A lot of organizations that installed these in their parking facilities did it to get LEED certification or LEED credit. So they sort of saw it as an additional feature, but not necessarily a revenue source. And the market was so constrained that it didn't really make sense to ask for it. As a matter of fact, up until a few years ago, I only met with one client who had started to charge for electric charging on their campus, and they did it because they had doctors who would park all day in the spots otherwise. So they started charging just as a way to create turnover in those spaces. That said, that segment of market, like I said, is growing explosively. And it varies from community to community, but like down in Washington, D.C. right now, they're 10% of the rolling fleet that's on the ground in Maryland and Northern Virginia right now. And you're already seeing places that you would never think start charging, like hospitals that are now starting to charge for it because there's so much demand for it at this point. So buy them, install them, charge even a nominal rate right now because, hey, I'm told at one point gas was 10 cents a gallon too.
I remember that.
Yeah. Alderman Dow.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with Dory Brown today on the charging stations. And we're thinking of, if you're a city employee that has an electric vehicle, your card will be set up so you can just swipe it and get the charge. And if you're public, you would have to swipe a credit card or something, but they don't have the actual, or she's not aware of the actual fittings that go on the charging station that allow you to do that. And we had that problem, as Director Cummings well knows, for the DPW garage, DPW building. So that's gotta be resolved. Also, if the Joint Special School Building Committee goes along with it, we're gonna put the infrastructure into the parking lots to handle charging stations downstream. Because we don't wanna have to dig up the parking lot again to put the wiring and things out to where the charging stations are going to be. I don't believe we're putting the charging stations in unless the Joint Special twists my arm and, but, we are making infrastructure improvements to allow for 10 future charging stations for staff, city vehicles, And if it's used by parents, they'd have to figure out how they do the charging, no pun intended, but the charging for the electricity.
Alderman Clemmons.
Yeah, on that, I mean, there are private companies that do it, and ChargePoint, I think, is the biggest one. They're the ones that regulate the one at my office, and I think they're probably the largest one, so you could partner with them.
Okay, yes, Alderman Como.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to thank Mr. Hill for his time, and as is my habit, if it is all right with you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion to accept this presentation and place it on file so it can be added to the agenda.
Motion is to accept the presentation, place it on file, so it becomes part of the agenda. All those in favor signify by saying yes.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, moving right along, communications,
There are none.
unfinished business,
There is none.
petitions,
There are none.
new business resolutions,
There is none.
new business ordinances,
There is none.
tabled in committee.
There is none.
General discussion, we'll hold that to go to remarks by Alderman, but I don't see anybody here for public comment, so we'll go to remarks by Alderman. Start over here, anybody? Okay, seeing no remarks. Alderman Dowd,
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And I thank you too, Mr. Hill, for your attendance. Thank you.